Kia ora and welcome to Outspoken. I'm Todd Niall. Auckland is not like the rest of New Zealand in many ways, and one of them being its ethnic makeup. It's a makeup that is changing rapidly, and in just 21 years, Pākehā or Europeans will be a minority in Auckland at 48%, and nationwide that figure in 2013 was 74%. The other big movers in Auckland are those of Asian descent, who will be up from 28% to 35% of the city's population. Pacifica rise by 2% to 17% and Māori by 1% to 12% in the year 2038. The question is, though, will the new face of Auckland, particularly that increasingly Asian face, be seen in key parts of society, politics, business, education, the arts, or will Auckland still be a city largely run by a Pākehā establishment? I'm joined this morning by Professor Paul Spoonley, Pro-Vice-Chancellor from Massey University's College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and one of the country's leading demographers. Julie Zhu is 25, a filmmaker, works in the theatre, touching on activism. She's stood in both local and general elections for the Green Party in the Botany area in East Auckland. And like Julie, Shail Kaushal came from India, unlike Julie, but he came to New Zealand with his family as a child. He's 24, active in politics in the Labour Party, and elected in October as a member of Auckland Council's Puketapapa local board, and says he's the youngest person of Asian descent to be elected to a governance structure in New Zealand. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Thank you, Todd. Great to be here.
Paul Spoonley, firstly, how significant is, without making it a line in the sand, that date around 2038, how significant is it for Pākehā or the dominant group in a city to move into being the minority?
Yes, we refer to it as a majority minority. I think it's quite significant, but of course there are age differences. So the two other members of this panel this morning represent the future face of Auckland. So they're younger, they're from Asia, China, India would be our two biggest source countries. And what you'll see is a shift, both generational but also ethnic, over the next 20 years. And I think the tipping point will actually come quite a bit earlier than the 2038 that Statistics New Zealand are identifying as being the point at which the majority European and Pākehā become that minority. So I would anticipate, given our current growth rates, that is more likely to occur in the late 2020s, so about 10 years from now.
Julie, you've spent most of your life here. Do you get the feeling, we're not at that point yet that's coming, but do you get the feeling even at the moment that the numbers are reflected in how Auckland actually works and who's running what?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because demographically things are changing, but I think the dominant culture is still there and it's still Pākehā culture. So even though Pākehā might be a minority in 20 years or so, I feel like I'm not sure if we're currently making those moves towards changing our social structures and systems to really reflect what a changing dominant culture might be. I think New Zealand's still very monocultural, and even Auckland. I think we talk about multiculturalism a lot, but in reality we're almost more multi-ethnic. We have a lot of ethnic groups, but culturally we don't embrace all of those cultures. We kind of have tokenistic days, cultural festival days, where those are showcased for a little bit, but I think generally we're still very monocultural. But I think it is significant that we're moving towards a place where we can start to unpack that, hey, this doesn't need to be the norm. And it hasn't always been the norm in New Zealand. We've also had Māori culture kind of be the only culture up to a point in history, until Pākehā kind of overtook Māori maybe around 1860. So I think that shift has happened in New Zealand before and it's been dealt with, and now we need to look at what this new culture society does look like.
Shail, how do you feel about that? You're obviously at a political level, you're pretty engaged in the system, but how do you feel about how the culture that you're a part of, or the ethnic group that you're a part of, are reflected in wider Auckland?
Well, I think, my feeling has always been that in reality, especially in the political structures, when you look at the Asian group, it's not just one group. There's a range of different ethnicities put together. So when we're considering that in the future the Pākehā ethnic group would be at a decline, sure, that they may be at a decline compared to the 74% previously, but in reality there will still be the single biggest ethnicity in New Zealand. So that doesn't really create that that the ethnicity is in danger as such. But when you look at sort of the Asian representation at council, in the 2013 term, the term before the current term, the stats were about, I think they were about just about 1% ethnic representation on the council at that point. Whereas since the 2016 election, it has improved quite significantly. It's not nowhere near what it should be or what it would be reflected as based on the population of people of Asian demographic within Auckland, but it is still better than what we had previously, and I think over time it will nonetheless improve.
We look at the council, for example, in a political sense as being that governing body, but Paul, you've been looking at some of the numbers in the second tier, the local boards, which in some ways are a feeder to the council. How's the future looking if you look at it that way?
It's changing, but very, very slowly. So in the 2013 elections, two people, Peter Chan and Susan Zhu, were elected on, and they've been joined by 6 others. So there's now 8, including Shail here. It's still,
actually, there was also Ami Chand in 2013 term.
Yes.
So there were 3.
Yeah.
More than 3, I think.
Yeah. So it's gone from 1%, but it's still way behind what it should be given the population of those local boards. So most of the local boards have very little non-Pākehā representation, and it's still very, very Pākehā dominant. So it's dropped from the 88% that it was in the 2013 elections, but it really hasn't dropped much below 80%. So it still represents part of the community and not other parts of the community. And remembering that nearly 30% of the wider community are now from one of the Asian communities.
Julie, you ran out in the local body elections out east. What was your experience as, how it went for you and I guess how the Chinese community or the ethnic communities out there related to you or not?
Yeah, I think this is something I brought up while I was running for the local body elections, is that a lot of the systems and structures that are in place do kind of reinforce the existing power structures and who's in power. For example, the voting system, it's very hard for new people, whether they're of any ethnic minority background, to kind of get a foot in when the existing people are so well known in the current voting system. I think if we move towards an SCV system, where people could rank their preferred candidates, I think that would be much better and would allow much more new blood to kind of get in onto the local board. And especially if you are an ethnic minority, it doesn't matter if you are 40% of the population, which it is out east for the Asian population, that's still a minority, and it's very hard for you to be able to have someone that represents you get on board when the majority of the population still votes for people that they feel familiar to, that look like them and sound like them. So I think there are a lot of barriers in place, and if we do want to kind of redress them, there needs to be major shifts and a mindset shift with everyone. We need to kind of encourage everyone to be looking for how do we seek to put up representatives that do represent all of us, and encourage people, even if they do belong to that dominant group, to look at what is fairness and equity for everyone, for our neighbours, to feel like they have people that they can be represented by.
And can I add something? I mean, the vote in the last election was incredibly low, 35%, and we know that new migrants are not voting, and so we should ask the question, what sort of electoral system would signal to them that their vote is important and that it is worth voting and that we need to encourage them to vote?
Shail, you obviously got elected, so it worked for you. But do you think, does the system need to change? Do we need to get away from that sort of first past the post, at least at a local level?
Yeah. The reality is that it really didn't just work for me, it worked for a number of other people. And I think one of the issues out east is that, because I've actually managed a campaign out east in Pakuranga back in my early days. It's very hard for a progressive to win in East Auckland. So there are other factors at play there. But I mean, if you look at the sort of the more ethnically diverse areas, which is basically the Isthmus Auckland area, we have got ethnic representation out in our local board. We had 2 local board members back in the previous term. Now we're back to 1. In Puki Tāpapa, we have 2 ethnic members. That gives us about 33% of the population, well, 33% board membership. Compared to the population, it's still low, but nonetheless, it's probably better than any other local board. Out in Albert Eden, we have Benjamin Lee. And so, we are starting to see that shift occurring. And the reality is that, no voting system would be perfect. But then again...
Different parts of town, though, aren't they? I guess we've got to have something that works across Auckland. And I think, Julie, you referred to a level of racism that you felt at that stage in the local campaign where you were. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean racism directed towards me personally, but I do feel like there is this just undercurrent of racism within East Auckland, within a certain part of the population. And I don't think it's people being aware of it. I think they don't think they're racist, but I've seen sort of comments online on this East Auckland Grapevine forum, and a lot of comments where they post about seeing someone dodgy walking on their street, and what dodgy is code for brown. Or that they'll talk about an old Asian lady that's picking fruit off their trees, but it's completely unnecessary to label the ethnicity of that person. And just a kind of feeling like this is their community and others are not welcome, others are impeding on something. And I think that's a really big barrier, and something I think will shift over the next few years as the younger generation kind of steps forward, a younger generation that has grown up with all these different ethnicities among their friends, who know it's fine to hang out with all sorts of people and don't have these kind of ingrained things that I guess is generational and things that people have internalised.
So Shail and Julie, you both have contested at local level where there is, perhaps not hugely more diversity than at the council level, but do you see that flowing through? Is that something that the level of diversity that we see at the local board level in politics will rise up into the council with time, or does something else have to change?
I mean, Todd, for that, we really need to look at the areas, basically. If you do look at sort of the ward structure, one might say it's not very friendly towards ethnic minorities for them to stand in a ward structure and get elected as councillors. But having said that, that was the same case for local boards. Before about 2 or 3 terms ago, people would have thought that's exactly the same case for local boards. That doesn't allow ethnic minorities to actually get a foothold in the structure and ensure they are able to represent, themselves and the wider community, not the ones that are part of, but also the wider community that they belong to at council level. But, that has shifted. So I think, with the population shifts here and there, things would change, even at a ward level. But having said that, when you are elected to office, you're not elected to represent that one particular ethnicity. Sure. You're elected to represent the entire area. That's something, that's something we do have to be very careful about. And it's also about ensuring that ultimately politics is a numbers game. So you do have to build up your support, firstly in the people who are voting, doesn't matter who they are, and secondly you have to get as many people as out to vote for you, and that is done through policy, candidate's personality, and through campaign strategies.
Are we going to get there, whether it's politics or not? Are we simply going to get there by time? The Auckland I grew up in is completely different to the Auckland that my now adult children have grown up in. So can we expect time is going to sort all these things out like politics?
Yes and no. I think we're seeing the generational change in this room of people who have either been born here or brought up here, who are experienced and know the system and are prepared to take part in that system. So I think the second generation are going to be a game changer in terms of participation in politics. And you can see that in the Auckland elections. What I would ask, though, are the questions about the local communities. Are local voters prepared to see a candidate who might be a different ethnicity to themselves as being a suitable representative for them? So I think we should ask those questions. We should ask questions about the council. At the council level, will political parties see people who are of different ethnicities as being appropriate to put up and to support and to make available the resources that are necessary to win at council level, are they going to pick that? They have done it at national level, which is interesting. But in terms of Auckland Council, we've yet to see it.
Because parties don't have a role, so they don't have that ability with lists to change the mix.
No, but they do play an important role in terms of selecting a ticket and supporting that ticket, Todd.
Let's look at something beyond or other than politics. Julie, you've made a documentary. You made an interesting documentary about your parents, your grandparents' experience, and you've done a theatre piece which looked at the experiences of Chinese people in Auckland. In the area of arts and culture, I mean, is that still a minority thing that's going on? Are we seeing enough and a diverse enough picture?
I think it's probably more rapid in the arts area than in politics, for example. I think arts, maybe the main practitioners I'm surrounded by are younger, so they're more diverse and they have more diverse stories and identities that they want to talk about. So I feel like the arts world also just has a better understanding of the importance of representation. I think over the last few years, you've seen these tropes of Hollywood so white or Oscars so white, those sorts of tropes which are internationally, I think there's kind of a movement that people are starting to recognise that media is so important in how we grow up and see ourselves and see how we're represented. And when you have such a dominant force in power that controls how we grow up seeing ourselves, that is something that needs to change. And it's something that's very pervasive in Hollywood, but also here locally. And I think practitioners are now kind of starting to change that. So, for example, the Auckland Theatre Awards were last Monday, and I only kind of realised towards the end that there pretty much was not a winner that was a white man of any of the main kind of excellence awards. Besides the Lifetime Achievement Award. But it was really interesting. Most of the award winners were women and people of colour. And I think the reason that's happening is because the industry is kind of rallying around this call that diversity is important and we need to champion it. And not in a tokenistic way, but to really understand that stories can come from different perspectives. There's not one value system to grade works on. And also, I think at a leadership level, the judges that were part of creating the award ceremony, not the award ceremony, but the awards, they kind of represented different backgrounds and understood the importance. I think that is also where that change in politics can happen, is when all people, like you said, it has to come from the dominant group as well. They have to be okay with the fact that someone who does not look like them can also represent them.
Shail, do you have areas of life around Auckland that you look at and think, that's moving along as it should or not, in terms of reflecting the city as a whole ethnically?
Sure. I mean, Todd, I've always thought of Mount Roskill as the model for Auckland and as the model for New Zealand and as the model for the world. I mean, we have over 190 odd ethnicities calling Mount Roskill home. They're all living in peace and harmony. And I mean, it's just one of those areas which really fosters your confidence that, this is how Auckland and the rest of New Zealand can look like and would look like nonetheless. So, I mean, change is occurring, and it's occurring in a very sort of a subtle possible way, and I'm going to call it subtle. I know that's probably not the most agreed position here, but it is occurring in a more subtle way. I mean, it's not something that will just happen overnight, and suddenly we'll wake up to it and realize, hey, Auckland is now multicultural. What do we do now? It is sort of going to happen over years and years and years, and people are getting used to it. So I mean, I think Auckland is a multicultural city. I mean, it always has been. Firstly, we were multicultural back in the day, but since the since the 1980s and the 1970s, we have always started to see ourselves as a Pacifica city. We have really embraced our Pacific identity, and that's reflected in our foreign policy as well.
Is that you mentioned Pacifica? Is that going to be a challenge for Auckland? Is the place of Maori and the place of Pacifica in an increasingly diverse society?
Yeah, for me, I don't want to conflate the two. I think for me, what's more significant about this 2038 date or the next few years, whenever this happens, is not necessarily the point when Pākehā become the minority, but the point where I think Asian kind of overtakes Māori as the next biggest minority, because I think that's very significant for the implications it could have for Māori and for our bicultural kind of state. I think currently we don't have strong enough foundations for people to understand why Te Tiriti o Waitangi is so important, why the role of tangata whenua here is so important. And I think that kind of will get invalidated even more when they're overtaken by a different minority.
Because Māori, for example, quite rightly would argue that it's taken them an awfully long time to get to a place probably where they're not yet where they feel they should be. I mean, is there a new dynamic there that we have to worry about, Paul?
Well, there is, and I mean, in terms of Auckland, it's already happened. So the Asian community is now considerably larger than the Māori community of Auckland, and yet Auckland is the largest Māori community in the country. Right. So I think Auckland is the test case or the laboratory in which we get to play, and play is probably the wrong word because it's much more serious than that, but in which we get to play around and decide how we do politics, and in this case, recognition of diversity. And we started today by talking about council and the wards, and we're far from getting that right. So we need to ask the question right around the community: are there differences between people who are tangata whenua in terms of recognition as opposed to those who are immigrants and their descendants? And my answer is yes.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think the conversation should be a very different conversation. And so I react quite strongly and very negatively when people say, there's me, I'm Pākehā, and there's others who are different. No, there are not. They're not all the same. And we need to recognise and nuance those sorts of conversations.
I feel like with that kind of positioning of Pākehā versus everyone else, I always try to think of the ideal as being Māori and everyone else, because Māori they're kind of the only unique kind of aspect of New Zealand that really needs to be upheld if we are to move forward. And I think there just needs to be more solidarity.
Shail, you've been, one of your areas of study is a sort of an international look at things. So I wonder, what about Auckland and the rest of New Zealand? I mean, if Auckland becomes increasingly different to the rest of New Zealand, does that create difficulty, you think?
I mean, I don't think they will create difficulties as such. I think it more rather presents opportunities. I mean, the reality is that with Auckland and New Zealand, with the multicultural diaspora, it actually gives us a very strong bridge where the country can build its economic relations upon. So it in fact presents us a very great opportunity, which I think would be beneficial for New Zealand.
But internally within New Zealand, if Auckland looks so different to the rest of the country, Paul, do you think, does that create a problem?
I think it does. I mean, as soon as you travel outside Auckland, you realise that there is a different country out there. So Auckland's, the fourth most diverse city in the world. Almost 60% of its residents are either immigrants born overseas or the children of immigrants. It is an incredibly diverse, and I would call it super diverse city. So when you go to the rest of New Zealand, you realise that the rest of New Zealand ain't like that. I mean, many areas have got a much higher proportion of their population who are Māori and occasionally Pacifica. So I think we need to have a conversation about how we do connect, because I often sense quite a degree of hostility, and it's not simply about ethnic diversity, it's about a whole lot of other things. It's how big Auckland's growing, how much it dominates politics or the media. So, it's one of those conversations that you're always going to have when you have a primate or a dominant city versus the rest of the country. But I think Auckland's ethnicity is one of those points that really separates the city from elsewhere, and I think we need to have a conversation. We need good media coverage and to explain what that means and why it is a virtue, not a problem.
I mean, if you look at the issues outside Auckland, the reality is that the rest of Auckland, the rest of the country have always seen always seen Auckland as a bit of a Auckland has always seen a bit of a Javas,
Yes.
and there are a number of other aspects at play, as you rightly said. But having said that, I think it hasn't really presented much of a challenge. I mean, in my view, if you look at Christchurch, for example, sure, with the earthquakes and with the disasters there. there is a now strong migrant population that that's been building up in the city. But if you look at even before that, Christchurch was one of those cities where you had Suki Turner as the mayor of the city. Dunedin. Sorry, it was Dunedin, and then it was followed by, maybe we can edit that bit out. It's probably a good idea not to look foolish. But Suki Turner as mayor of Dunedin. Then it was followed by Peter Chin. So we are starting to see that shift occurring in other cities. So it's not just Auckland. I think it's sort of happening all across New Zealand. But Auckland is, as you rightly said, will be a bit of a test case because in our sense it will have the migration patterns and that's again based on the Auckland economic opportunities and other opportunities that Auckland provides will happen much more greater here than before the other country. But then again, the same demographic shift will be occurring all across the nation, and I think that really wouldn't present much of a challenge because the rest of the country would say, and New Zealanders are rational people. They do understand that ultimately, it is something that's not just happening in New Zealand. It's something that's happening around the world. With increasing globalization, increasing interconnectedness, people are moving. People are, moving to other countries. They're making new homes. They're building up their lives. So, I mean, and the reality is that New Zealand would look a lot more different than, what it was 100 or, 50, 60 years ago. So it's not something that, I don't think it's something that the country would be concerned about. They will still treat Auckland as Auckland. And doesn't matter how Auckland looks like, they will still consider it as a bit of a Jaffas, to be honest.
Yeah. I think Shail's a bit more optimistic than I. I think we've got some challenges. We have some challenges.
Helps being young.
There we are. A generational difference of opinion.
Yeah. So what is the challenge between the rest of New Zealand and Auckland, if they evolve in different ways?
Well, I think it's one of growth. I mean, Auckland is the growth centre for New Zealand, and increasingly that growth is being driven by immigration. So if you don't get immigrants in your community around New Zealand, you're not growing. And so already we're beginning to see that 2/3 of the territorial authorities in New Zealand are experiencing population stagnation, and of course recently with the west coast of the South Island, population decline. So there's a dynamic there, which is people as much as it is economic. But of course, as we see Auckland grow, and we're forecasting that 60% of the next 2 decades' growth will occur in Auckland, and Auckland will ultimately be home to 40% of all New Zealanders, I think we need to have a conversation about regional disparities and what that means in terms of for us as a country. I think the other big conversation we need to have is how do we reflect the diversity of Auckland and of New Zealand in our national institutions. So we've been talking about Auckland, but we could also ask the same question about other parts of the country and of course our parliament.
Julie, how are you feeling about, in 20 years' time, you guys will be the sort of the power group age, I guess, if you like, in terms of society. Are you feeling that it's going to look the way you want it to, progressively? Are you feeling optimistic about where that's going to end up?
Yeah, I think I think it can only kind of get better as people become more used to what difference looks like, what living with difference looks like. I think if we're thinking nationally, it does mean that we have to help support people to adapt. People who may not live in Auckland may not see and understand the growth in their everyday lives. And I think that's where kind of cultural competency comes in, where maybe it's even in schools, just teaching kids what it means to have power, what privilege is, what the history of New Zealand colonisation, the impacts and legacy of that is, because otherwise you're stuck with this rhetoric that is spouted by people like John Brash, like William Gallagher, but also directed at migrants and people of colour. And I think that's something that needs to shift, but it is shifting, I think, globally.
Could I ask a question, Julie? Yeah. If we do see this shift, and people like yourself and Shail are represented in our political systems, what would change? Do you think that we should assume that because people are from a minority ethnic or immigrant communities, they are somehow going to be better at reflecting and representing and incorporating diversity? That's my first question. But what would change if you became Mayor of Auckland?
I think definitely that people from different backgrounds, whether that's ethnic backgrounds or other lived experiences, always bring something different to leadership structures and power dynamics. So that's always going to be a beneficial thing. And it's reflected in other kind of intersectional identities like women of colour as a minority within a minority. So I think that's always going to be good. I don't necessarily think that any particular one person will represent that particular ethnicity. For example, I know because of my lived experience of having grown up here and at a point in my childhood abandoning a lot of my Chinese side because of racism that I felt at school or whatever, that I don't now necessarily represent the Chinese community because I'm not confident in the language. I don't have the experience of most older generations of migrants who face different barriers, language barriers, things like that I just wouldn't understand. So I don't think one person can reflect that.
We should ask Shail as well. If you became the MP for Mount Roskill, if you became the MP for Mount Roskill, would that say something to the ethnic group that you came from?
I think it will say not only something to the ethnic group that I come from, but also to the other ethnic groups that do call Mount Roskill or even Auckland home, because it will then give them that. Because ultimately what tends to happen is that if you do have more diverse representation on the decision-making table, it does give those communities who are disenfranchised or who do not feel comfortable in raising those concerns because of the past government experience that they have witnessed overseas or, where they come from, it gives them the confidence that, they can actually have their say. And I'll give you an example of that. I mean, I was out and about in Mount Roskill a couple of years ago. It was regarding the no asset sales petition back in the day. So I was out about with the local MP, Phil Goff. So I was door knocking one of the old streets where I used to live, Harville Crescent. And I door knocked on one of the guys' houses, and I told them that, we're out and about collecting signatures to keep our assets. This is against the government's plans. And you should have seen the look on his face. As soon as I said this is against the government's plans, he literally closed the door on me and he ran inside his house. And, it's just part of that experience. I mean, that probably that guy had with government back in his hometown or his home country. So again, but if we are able to sort of make that conversation more culturally appropriate and do take into account that, there will be people who do have those experiences and there will be people who have language barriers, for example.
And is that what's going to be important, is getting people, whether it's politics, arts, getting different faces through that others can follow?
I mean, the reality is that we have to get people involved. I mean, I think even part of this whole debate or this whole notion that, Auckland will be multicultural, I think it doesn't matter which side of the debate you're on, whether you're for or against it. The matter is that you have to get involved. We have to take both sides into account. I mean, especially as governors, we do have to take both sides with us and have to ensure that, whatever discussions that we are having, it is held in a more constructive manner. So I think that's mainly important for the governance structure, and I would say probably for the media as well.
Julie, easier said than done? Getting people involved?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, is that the focus is always on how do we get more diversity, how do we bring them here. And it's always framed as the underrepresentation of certain voices, but you can flip it the other way and talk about the overrepresentation of Pākehā men, for example. The people who have been in power also need to take responsibility and give up some of that power to recognise that it's not fair how long this power has been held, and to make way.
Individual politicians saying, hey, it's time for me to stand
kind
back
of,
now.
Yeah. I think that's actually really important and bold. And it's probably not going to happen.
No, that's right. But I mean, especially in politics, I mean, you don't say, well, politics is one of those games where people don't go by their own, they have to be forced out of their office.
But I think that is the mindset that needs to shift, and that is the framing of the conversation that needs to be moved towards in order to really have a shift that will impact on everyone, all the voters who need to recognise that this is an issue that we can all have a part in. The burden's not on the minority to step up.
I think, actually, part of it is, and the reality is that I'm not completely blaming the migrants that, they have to do things based on the norms been set. But what I'm saying is that ultimately, there is a notion that, as migrants, we do sometimes have to understand the system very well. We have to get used to it. And then if there are changes we want to implement, we need to implement them. And that often tends to be by getting involved, firstly politically, or whether it is through social organizations. And then it's about, making that case. And again, when we do sort of have that sort of credible set of candidates coming in, And again, things would change. So, I mean, especially with the next generation, who will be more multicultural than we ever were. They'll be more colourful than we ever were.
Let's go to Paul on that one. Will we just get there? Will we change simply as, or doesn't it always happen that way?
No, it doesn't always happen that way. And so a few years ago, I was a co-author of a cabinet paper on social cohesion, which the government then decided to ignore. And I think we actually do need to work at cohesion, that might not be the right term, but we need to work at it, because if you think back to the shift that occurred politically in terms of recognising Māori and Māori becoming part of national politics, the 1970s and 1980s, that was a pretty intense period in which there was a lot of angst and a lot of concern and quite a lot of tension. So I don't think we should. I'm being the Grinch here, but I don't think we should expect it just to occur sort of organically. I think we've got to work at it. And I've been a judge for the Diversity Awards, and so I go out and visit Auckland businesses, and I think there's some wonderful best cases where people have said our community, our clients, our customers are now culturally divergent, and our workforce is divergent. We need to do things differently. What I'm concerned about are the people who either don't understand, don't care, or are actually hostile. How do we, to pick up Shail's point, how do we get them to shift their opinion? And so I would love us to see strong, powerful, visionary leadership in Auckland. I think that's part of it. Bottom up, top down, both.
So I mean, just following up on that point, for example, in Puketapapa, and I totally agree. I mean, to get people involved, we do have to implement some strategies, and again, that comes back on the governance structure. So what we did back in Puketapapa was that this time when we went out for our consultation for the local board plan, we translated every consultation material into Chinese, because we felt there were a significant amount of people who would not be able to have their say.
Made a difference?
It did make a difference. We did receive number of material from members of the Chinese community who didn't indicate, what the concerns were, whether we were on track, and what we needed implemented. And I think this time around, with the long-term plan, which will go into consultation in 2018, there is a strong focus that it will focus on migrant population and trying to understand, what their views are.
Julie, out east, will that work? Is there enough of that going on, translation, connecting with people in their own language?
I think translation helps, but in a way it's still a kind of top surface level gesture to make. I know recently there's been a big transport shift out in East Auckland with all the bus numbers changing, which really affects the local elderly Asian community who catch the bus regularly to go grocery shopping, which is what the documentary is about. And there hasn't been enough consultation with that community before all these changes are being made, and there is a lot of confusion out there, even for English speaking kind of people. So I think gestures are always good. Like, you can't go wrong with translation, but you can always do more. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for Outspoken. I've been talking to Professor Paul Spoonley, to Julie Zhu and to Shail Kaushal about the future ethnic mix of Auckland. Thanks for joining us. I'm Todd Niall, and that's Outspoken.